Am I muted, Keegan? Perfect. Good morning. It is a joy to be here on this Sunday morning with our friends out here, and perhaps those of you who are joining us online. It is a gorgeous fall day today, and I know that the weekends right now are just mad. And so as we come into this space and we find ourselves here, Justin, help us center ourselves in this moment of worship today with that incredible saxophone that you have. Thank you. And that was exactly what my heart needed this morning. Friends, this is, like I said, this is a crazy time of the year. It's been a crazy week. We've had a lot of things to do. We have a lot of things to do today. Some of us will be going from here, and going to a cross-country meet, and then going to the housing summit that's happening at Flores. Others will be taking maybe, hopefully, a small break, getting lunch, and then joining us at the housing conference there. We are really excited to be able to participate in something that Voice has put together. There are an incredible number of elected officials who will be at that summit, and a number of congregations from across Northern Virginia are going to be participating in this incredible gathering to really think through how we can organize ourselves to make a difference. You know, the other day was one of the big national protests, and there were in a couple of places, I can't remember exactly where it was, I'd have to look at my phone, some 30,000 people packed into this public space. And I was talking to a friend of mine about what would it look like if those 30,000 people who had gathered together to protest some of the policies that are harming our neighbors might have gathered at the housing summit today and to organize to work for affordable housing. There's some amazing things that I think can happen, and so what we're doing here with Voice really truly does matter. And so it's just part of the crazy day that is October in Northern Virginia, and so we are here to find ourselves in this space Not necessarily a space where we have to be quiet, and not necessarily a space where we have to be contemplative, but a space where we have come to be intentional about this worship that we call, of this God that we call ours. And so let's take a moment and let's root ourselves in this space that is not the space of a cross-country meet, that is not the space of a housing summit, that is not the space of our home, but a place where we have intentionally shown up to claim that we are following a way of a person named Jesus Christ, who we believe to be one of the distinct persons of the Holy Trinity of God. And so let's be intentional in this moment. If we were in a yoga class, I'd say set an intention in your heart. And that's kind of what prayer does. So find yourselves here. Plant your feet here in this space. Feel the ground underneath you. And most importantly, feel your breath. Through our day-to-day lives, we just breathe without thinking about it, but let's be intentional for a moment and find our breath. Breathe in, and then breathe out. And feel how that breath goes deep into your belly, your diaphragm expanding and contracting. And recognize that even though we say, this is my breath, that breath in our lungs is God. Friends, let's pray together. Holy God, we come to this place that we call church, to be a community of people drawn together by a covenant with you. That word covenant can be so hard to understand. And so today, as we dive into your words, the words that you gave to Moses, and you gave through Moses, help us to understand what covenant means with you, what you expect of us, and God, what we can expect of you. Help us to be the people you claim that we are, so that we can go from here and share who you are with others by the things that we say, but more importantly, by the things that we do. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who tried to show us who you were. Amen. Amen. Welcome. Come on in, friends. It's good to have you today. We're just getting into it, so you are perfectly on time, but we're good Methodists, so you're always on time, no matter when you show up. I'm going to take this off because it is something about, here we are, something about standing up here under lights that makes life a little bit harder. Wearing a jacket, even though I think it makes my outfit look particularly fall-like. All right, friends, so we're in the middle of confirmation here, whole church confirmation. And we are today, last week we talked about what it meant that God created the world as good and called it tov and called people very good. And then what happened in the fall and what happened with sin and what sin does. And I told you that, it's good to talk about what sin does, but we also, if we're going to talk about what sin does, we have to talk about who God is and how God responds to that. And what I think is really, really interesting, can you go to the sermon slide, not the text yet, but the sermon slide. What I think is really interesting is that the way that God responds to human sin is through covenant. Now, I think the word covenant is hard for us because for most of us, when we think about the word covenant, we go back to the Hebrew Bible. We go back to what we sometimes call the Old Testament. And there is a general belief, a general feeling, belief might not be right, but a general feeling that sometimes the God in the Old Testament is a very angry God, and we would rather just spend time hanging out in the New Testament because Jesus talks about love and stuff a lot. It's all right, Dan, not picking on you. Maybe I am. But, and what's really interesting about that kind of feeling is that, one, it's a heresy, which is fun to talk about, but also it's a heresy that's real old. I mean, it goes back to the very beginnings of the early church. We're talking 100s, 200s, CE, so not prior to that, but like very, very old heresy. Because it is, like, how do we understand what's going on in the Hebrew Bible, especially because sometimes God's anger is very real in the Hebrew Bible. And so how do we sort of reconcile that? And we have to reconcile it through an understanding of covenant. And so that's how we're going to get there today. So we've talked a little bit about how when we read some of the things in the Hebrew Bible, we're not talking about some very literal stories. A lot of them are stories about how these folks in the ancient Near East, the Hebrew people, tried to make sense of their world and how God was acting in it. And so we find that when we start talking about covenant. What is really interesting, well, there's many interesting things here, but one of the first things is that when God acts in history, because that's what we believe. We believe in a God who breaks into history, not just in the person of Jesus Christ, although that's a really good example, but breaks into history in lots of different times and ways, and acts in a way that can become legible, we can understand, by actually participating in history. And so when we think about covenant, we have to go real far back. And we have to talk about a group of people called the Hittites, and we have to talk about the Assyrians. I mean, you can't really get out of the Old Testament if you don't talk about the Assyrians, and then eventually the Babylonians. But the thing that's really interesting here for me, well, I think I'm saying that a lot, but that's just because this is really fascinating history for me, is that the Hittites and the Assyrians would go in to various other empires and take them over. That's what the Assyrians were very famous for, and that's what a lot of the Hebrew Bible is about, like people being very scared that the Assyrians are going to jump in and they're going to harm them. So the Hittites and the Assyrians, first the Hittites and then they were eventually taken over by the Assyrians, would go into these other empires, these other nations, and they would take them over, but it wasn't like a wholesale, like, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to just assume everything that you are, and that's just where we're going to be. They would go in and they would start to create these things that were treaties. They're essentially treaties. And what we call them are a suzerain vassal treaty. That's some very serious history words, but I want you to know them. Suzerain vassal. A suzerain is the one who's in charge. The vassal is the one that they would make the treaty with. A vassal means basically that they would become, they would be taken care of by the suzerain. So this is like the history of what it looked like to be part of a political empire in the ancient Near East, is that you would have the Hittites and then eventually the Assyrians coming in, and they would come in as a vassarin and say, all right, we're going to take you over, but we're going to do it in this sort of covenantal way. We are going to take care, you are going to become a part of us, we are going to care for you, and here are the ways that we're going to do that. Keegan, can you go go to the first sermon slide for me so I can put this up? So we can look at the history of these treaties. You didn't know you were going to get a history lecture today, did you? We can look, that's a very tiny print, so I'm going to say these things out loud to you. We would go, you can look at the history of these treaties and you can identify 6 elements of these treaties. This is really important, and I'm going to show you why in just a second. The treaty would always start with a preamble where the suzerain would identify themselves. I am, Lord Giacomo of the Hittites. I'm making these names up. Those aren't real names, right? But it would say a thing in the very beginning, a preamble. There would always be a prologue. And in that prologue, the suzerain nation would recount the history of the relationship that they had had. These are relational treaties. The third thing would be covenant stipulations. You need to do X, Y, and Z. That's how we're going to form this relationship. If you do X, Y, and Z, I will then do A, B, and C for you, and we'll make that happen. Then there's always a point in there that there would be provisions for periodic reading to remind people of what was happening, that this covenant existed between the suzerain and the vassal states. And then there were also in that section ways to keep that covenant safe, because it would be written down on either tablets, often tablets, but then eventually moving into various forms of like parchmenty stuff, right, papyrus. And then the 5th part is that there were witnesses to the covenant. So-and-so and so-and-so witness that this happened, and we're going to make sure that both sides are going to hold up what they say is going to happen. And then the 6th part would always include blessings, blessings that would come to the vassal state if the vassal kept their side of the covenant, and curses if the vassal chose to not keep their side of the covenant. So we can see, literally, you can go through all of these different suzerain-vassal treaties, and you can see this play out in all of them, which is really cool. And then we get to the Old Testament. Can you go to my second slide? So when we're talking about covenant, we are talking about Mosaic covenant right now. So the covenant that God gave to the people through Moses. We call it Mosaic covenant. And what's really interesting is that we can apply the suzerain vassal treaty format to the covenant that God gives to God's people. So it's really interesting to me that the way that the ancient Hebrew people were explaining how God cared for them was through the language of the treaties that they themselves had been made subject to. So the Hebrew people were vassal states, and they had seen this play out in the empires around them. So for instance, in Exodus 20, we get the preamble, right? Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. And then the second part of that, it recounts the relationship, right? God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The relationship is there. Who am I? I am God, and I am the one who brought you out of slavery, friends. That's who I am. Not me. I'm not that person. But that's what God says in this. And then we can see that also, you can see because Exodus and Deuteronomy share stories, right? Deuteronomy is sort of the giving of laws, and Exodus is recounting the story of the Hebrew people out of Egypt. And then we get the prologue, and then we get all the covenant stipulations. Here's my question. The covenant stipulations in the covenant between God and the Israeli people What do we call that? What do we call those covenant stipulations? This is going to help you understand what's going on. The 10 Commandments. So the covenant stipulations that God gives the people through Moses are the 10 Commandments. So the very first thing that we see in Exodus, right? So God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Then we go on, you shall not make yourself an idol, right? And it just goes on. That's the covenant stipulations that God says, you are going to be my people, the Hebrew people. You will be my people, and I will be your God, and we will know that because you will have no other gods before me. You will not make idols. You will keep the Sabbath, right? We keep moving through all of the different covenant stipulations. And then there are so many places in Exodus and Deuteronomy where we can find, number 4, those provisions for periodic reading and the safekeeping of the covenant. You shall make an ark, and you shall place these tablets in the ark of the covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant. And in this way, it will be kept safe. We have the periodic readings of this in a, pardon me, and the thing that the Jewish people follow called Passover, where the child comes to the youngest person in the household, goes to the oldest person in the household and says, why is this night special? Why on all nights do we do this? And over the story of Passover that's told around that table, they tell the story of the Exodus and of the covenant, which is an incredible thing. I'm just going to say, in this space, it's okay that we make noise and ask questions. So feel free, if you're not sure what's going on, ask me questions. It's totally fine. No one has to be completely silent in this space. I can take your questions. I may not know the answers, but I know who to ask. And then there are witnesses to the covenant, but the witnesses to these covenants are not like a vizier, right? The holy wise man or a rabbi or whatever. The witnesses to this covenant are found in a cosmic level. Heaven and earth are witnesses to this covenant. And I love the language. Like, where am I going? I'm going to 420, so where am I? 30s? I'm in 30:19 through 20. I'm going to read you this. So God says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him,